Emma's shift rolled on like any other day, the hum of chatter and the hiss of the coffee machine filling the air, but her mind kept drifting back to the old man in the corner. He sat so quietly, cradling the warm cup between his frail hands as if it were more than coffee, it was shelter from a cold world. She watched him sip slowly, pausing as though he wanted to make it last, his gaze wandering over the cafe with a calmness that seemed out of place in the morning rush. She noticed details others might have missed. His shoes were scuffed, the laces uneven, and the cuffs of his coat were worn thin, but his posture was steady, his presence somehow dignified. He wasn't just passing through, he was observing, soaking in every gesture and word as if each moment mattered. Emma caught his eyes once, and in them she saw gratitude, quiet but deep, the kind that didn't need words. While she moved between tables, balancing trays and offering her practiced smile, she couldn't help but sense that the old man was studying her. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt searching, as if he were looking for something hidden behind her cheerful expression. She carried plates to a young mother struggling with her baby, whispering playful words to calm the crying child and sliding an extra napkin toward the weary woman with a wink. The old man's lips curled upward at that. Later, when a shivering homeless man stumbled in, Emma didn't hesitate. She offered him a seat near the heater and pulled a blanket from the lost and found, wrapping it around his shoulders. It wasn't policy, and she knew her boss might frown on it, but she didn't care. People mattered more than rules, and she had always believed a little kindness cost nothing. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the old man watching again, his fingers tapping lightly against the coffee mug as though he were holding back words. As the hours passed and the crowd thinned, he remained in his booth, quiet and unhurried. When Emma finally approached to clear his cup, he looked up at her with a softness that startled her. His voice, though quiet, carried weight. "You didn't have to do that," he said, eyes glancing at the empty cup she had paid for, then toward the blanket she had given away, then back to her. "But you did." Emma smiled lightly, brushing off the heaviness of his tone. "Sometimes people just need someone to care, even if it's something small. The world has enough harshness already." He nodded slowly, as if committing her words to memory, his expression one of thoughtful silence. When he finally rose to leave, he moved with the same quiet dignity as when he had arrived. But this time, Emma noticed something new. His smile lingered just a little longer, like he was carrying her kindness out the door with him. And she never imagined how far that kindness would take her. The rain tapped steadily against the cafe windows that morning, blurring the view of the street outside into a wash of gray and silver. Emma was wiping down tables, humming softly to herself, when the sound of car doors clicking shut drew her eyes toward the window. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you usually saw parked in front of their little cafe, a sleek black sedan, polished so perfectly it reflected the wet pavement like a mirror. From it stepped two men in dark suits, moving with sharp precision, followed by a figure she recognized instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the old man. But gone were the worn coat and scuffed shoes. Now he wore a tailored suit, crisp and commanding, his shoulders squared, his presence magnetic in a way that filled the room before he even walked through the door. The cafe seemed to still around him. Conversations hushed. Forks paused mid-air. Even the hiss of the coffee machine seemed quieter. Emma froze behind the counter, gripping the rag in her hand. He had been so humble, so ordinary just days before, a man who looked like he had little more than the change in his pocket. And now, he looked every bit the kind of man who owned boardrooms, commanded respect, and had the world bending to his will. He met her gaze and smiled, the same warm, gentle smile he had given her that morning over a cup of coffee. Yet now, it carried with it a gravity that unsettled her. The men in suits followed him in silence, but he lifted a hand, signaling them to wait by the door. Slowly, he made his way across the room, each step echoing with an authority that drew every eye. When he reached her, Emma's voice faltered. You're Richard Hayes," he finished for her, his tone calm but deliberate. The name struck her like a jolt. She had heard it before, splashed across newspapers and business magazines, spoken in financial news reports with reverence. Richard Hayes, an empire builder, a man whose wealth and influence stretched across industries, a billionaire who was often called one of the most powerful men in the country. Emma's heart raced, confusion knotting in her chest. She glanced at his face, searching for traces of the frail old man who had struggled with his change, but she still saw him there, the same eyes, the same quiet dignity. Only now, she understood that the story she had told herself was not the whole truth. Richard studied her expression, a glimmer of amusement flickering in his gaze. "I imagine this is a bit of a surprise." She let out a shaky laugh, still stunned. "That's one way to put it." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I didn't come here by accident. I wanted to see the person who could look at a stranger and choose kindness without expecting anything in return." Emma's throat tightened, her rag slipping from her hand onto the counter. She had no words, only the sudden realization that her life was about to change in ways she could never have foreseen. Emma's hands trembled as she set the rag aside, her eyes fixed on Richard Hayes as though trying to convince herself he was real. He didn't look like the weary man who had nursed a simple cup of coffee a few days earlier. He looked like someone carved out of wealth and authority, but his eyes were still the same. Warm, searching, steady. "Why me?" she finally whispered, her voice barely carrying over the soft hum of the cafe. "Why come back here?" Richard smiled faintly, leaning on the counter with the ease of an old friend. "Because you reminded me of something I had almost forgotten," he said. "That wealth means very little if you don't see people for who they are. That day, you didn't see a billionaire dressed in rags. You saw a man in need. And you gave, even when you had so little yourself." Emma's throat tightened. She thought of her mother's medical bills stacked on the kitchen table, the long nights she spent studying after her shifts, the endless worry about whether she'd ever catch up. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. To her, paying for his coffee was nothing more than a small act, one she would have done for anyone. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, setting it gently on the counter between them. "I want to do something for you, Emma. Not because I owe you, but because kindness like yours deserves to grow." She blinked at the envelope, hesitant to touch it. "What is this?" "Open it," he urged softly. With trembling fingers, she slid the flap open. Inside, she found a check that made her breath hitch. The amount was more than enough to cover her mother's surgery, and then some. But tucked behind it was something even more staggering. A scholarship letter, guaranteeing full tuition for her to finish her studies without debt. Her knees felt weak, and she gripped the counter for balance. I don't understand," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. Richard's expression softened. "You don't have to. Just accept it. Take care of your mother. Finish your degree. And keep being the person you are. The world needs more people like you, Emma." For a moment, the cafe seemed to fade away, the sound of dishes clattering, the chatter of customers, the patter of rain outside. All that remained was the weight of his words and the envelope in her hands, heavier than gold. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You already did," Richard replied, his smile kind and unwavering. That morning, with nothing more than a cup of coffee, Emma pressed the envelope to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. In that instant, she realized her life had shifted forever. What she had given freely had returned to her in ways she could never have imagined, and all because of a simple choice to be kind.